the game is designed that if the British want to go first, they can almost always guarantee going first. However, they have to burn one of their 5 cards to guarantee it. And then there's always the weird moment when somebody rolls a 6. I almost always throw my chief of staff card if I have him at the the initial agenda bid, and sometimes I roll a 6 and it screws the British up.
Cardboard Creations, where we discuss the process, techniques, and inspiration for designing board games. I'm your host, Candice Harris, and I'm thrilled to be here today with Mark Herman to find out how Churchill was created. But first, let's jump into a brief overview of how Churchill works. Churchill is a 1 to 3 player game where you are one of the big 3, Churchill, Roosevelt, or Stalin, manipulating the end of World War II to your nation's relative advantage. A game of Churchill is played as a series of conferences. During a conference, players take turns playing cards of various strengths representing their staff to nominate, advance, and debate a variety of issues on the table. After the last staff card is played, players determine who won the conference and then implement each conference issue, changing the political and military situation on the board. Each conference concludes with a war phase, where players attempt to advance their allied military forces along their respective front tracks toward Germany and Japan. At the end of the 10th conference, or any conference when both Axis powers have surrendered, the game is over and players tally up their victory points from a variety of military accomplishments, political alignment markers, the atomic bomb research track, and more. The winner of the game is determined by one of 3 different victory conditions based on the outcome of the war and players' relative positions to each other on the victory point track. Hi, Mark. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Candice.
It is so great to have you here today. So, I've been playing and discovering and learning different types of war games and historical board games, and I'm really enjoying it. But I've noticed that I'm really especially drawn to games that focus on the political aspects of war. There's just something about them that I'm ooh, they just get me going. And your Great Statesman series just is all about that. And, those games are just so unique. So what initially inspired you to create Churchill?
I was reading a book on World War II diplomatic history, and it had a lot of content on, it seemed to do a good job of connecting the conferences to the broader military strategy as one of the themes in the book. And I really was fascinated by it, and I said, oh, what game could I play? I also do what I'll call book game pairings. People call it people do wine and food. I do, and that's a thing that gamers have done since forever. Another unique thing, and I was thinking about what game would I play, and I couldn't come up with anything, and so I said, oh well, maybe I should do one. So that's really the long and the short of the inspiration was just that book, not having something to play and experience it, so I just made my own.
Cool. How did you get from that initial idea into a playable prototype?
Yeah, so Churchill has an interesting. It actually has a genesis not unlike We the People went through. In other words, almost like a Risk game, like Risk, the classic Parker Brothers game. Very light cubes. Playing out World War II, and I had the conferences were almost like random number, and you would then there was a trick taking thing going on, and the game got finished. I mean, there was a whole playtest group. And the game was done, and it had already reached its P500 numbers, and so literally, if I pushed the button, it was going to production.
Wow.
And my main criteria for whether something goes to production is, am I personally addicted to playing the game myself? And I didn't like it. I mean, it wasn't doing anything for me. So I called up Gene Billingsley, my old friend, and I said, Gene, I'm going to redesign Churchill. I know it's made its P500 numbers, and I don't know if you want to run it again. He said, don't worry about it. And so I sat down and went through a process of saying, what do I like about the game that I had finished, and what do I don't like about the game? And what I didn't like was the risk wargaming piece was just not worth, it just wasn't worth it. And the conference thing, which was really the thing that was my original interest, was just not enough. And so I threw that one away. My level of art is like I can draw boxes in PowerPoint. And I figured out how to make a PowerPoint slide the size of a map.
Okay.
You can set the size. I found out you could set the size. And so that's how I started doing all my original maps for Churchill. I just took PowerPoint, made a 22 by 34 inch slide, and then I, put my boxes in there, and I started designing the game around the conferences. And then the war piece became almost like a imagine like a big scoreboard, right? The war is like the scoreboard, even though there are some rules. And I think that's why, remember, it ended up winning like War Game of the Year, and it's not really a war game, but it has a military resolution piece, which I guess makes it a war, even though I don't think of it as a war game. But so you've got and the military piece is based on a kind of modeling and simulation technique called a piston model. Like, in other words, you know how a piston works, like, I push against you and you push against me.
Right.
That moves things, except that I didn't want to go the back and forth, so it only goes in one direction. Either it doesn't move or it moves forward. And then, so that was a very simple way of keep showing you the impact of your decisions. And then you have that political overlay with the operations to support the partisans, and then of course the government's in exile and who has control over all those things.
Very cool. Very cool. Did you always know you were going to make the conference table?
That was the thing. So, and that is the mechanic that people either loved or they hated, but it is actually based, it's a simulation. I used to be a senior vice president in a large, general management consulting firm. And I basically modeled the conference mechanic on, if I was in 3,000 meetings, I was in 4,000 meetings over my career. I mean, that's all you do. You sit in a room, a bunch of people are sitting around a table, and so what it was trying to capture was, like, if you would be in a room and somebody would say, we had this HR problem, how are we going to do vacation days or something? And then everybody would sort of, and somebody would blap, and so that people go, yeah, that's a good idea. So you could see like the thing move in one direction. And then somebody who actually knew something about HR would say, well, those are really good ideas, except here are the 14 reasons why that's a really bad idea. And then all of a sudden you can see the thing flip the other way. And you can see this, and you could feel like the conversation driving the issue, whatever it was, back and forth. And then there was always the issue is if the boss was in the room, and he'd be sitting there listening to this thing, and he'd go, well, I think, and pretty much everything after I think was the answer. And that's like FDR talking, What FDR says, and the conversation's over. Yeah. And there was nobody in the room who could, when the chairman said we're going this way, it was like, hey, sounds great to me, So the Churchill mechanic is really a corporate meeting, as I felt it over thousands of times, of how issues, just the room would sway. You could almost, again, you can't measure it, but I had to measure the game obviously, but you could feel it happen. And I'm sure you have meetings in your life where you could feel that ebb and flow of the conversation. Eventually, it ends up somewhere, right?
Yes. Yep.
And that's basically the mechanic that I created for the game, which then really led to everything else. And then the actual issues are based on research. I read, all the conferences, the conferences had, and it's interesting, by the way, the note taking of the actual historical conferences is not like, it's not like a recording, like we're Zoom recording this thing, so you get every nuance. This is like some notes. Sometimes there's great notes, sometimes there's lousy notes, sometimes there's almost no notes, but you have like what they said, there was official outcomes, so it's sometimes hard to track. But that is captured in the conference cards. What was the discussion about? And And so, but the big thing is that you're representing your representative. You're the president, or you're the prime minister, or what was Stalin's role? I guess he was generalissimo or head of the Communist Party, whatever the heck his job was, his actual title was. And it's head of the Communist Party, the Politburo. But you got these three individuals, and they actually had small entourages. I mean, the cards represent, there's a picture, I think, in the rule booklet showing Churchill with the guys he took to the conference, and it's all, it's like 8 people, 5 people. So you're actually winging off to a conference with you plus, your entourage.
So cool. Yeah, I was actually going to ask, like, how much research, how much time you spent, like, researching to make this game, like, both sides, the conference side and the military side.
Well, the military side is, given my knowledge of that topic, I didn't have to do hardly any military research. I mean, there wasn't much about the war at that level, moving fronts.
Right.
I didn't already know. So there wasn't much required for that at all. But the military side, the political side, what issues they discussed and what were, capturing those agendas and how those agendas would play off each other, that was really the, I know there's a question later on why they call it Churchill, because that was the voice in my head, because he's the only one who wrote a memoir. FDR didn't write a memoir, and if Stalin wrote one, I've never seen it. So the only first-person narrative of the war, which, by the way, is very, it's Churchill's 6-volume history of World War II. So that was the voice in my head because he's writing in the first person.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so that's why it's called Churchill, because he's the only perspective I actually have. And I had a lot of friends, they said, you can't call it Churchill, you should be calling it the Big Three. I said, let me explain something. One, we're going to call it Churchill. One, if you put Churchill or Caesar or something like that on the cover, everybody knows what that is. So
right.
And I'll put it in the subtitle. So Churchill is just it's a gonzo title. You can't blow it.
Totally.
And it's very memorable. And also my kids went to Churchill High School. So,
oh, wow.
So just sort of, so Churchill is definitely going to be the title of the game. And again, it was his voice in my head about what he said they talked about.
Right.
And what I was thinking. Now, again, his memory of the war is very convenient at times. I got that part, but at this level of the game, that wasn't an issue.
Cool. Wow. So you have a background, you studied history, right?
I have a degree in it, yes. It's right over there.
Yeah, so some of this, because I often wonder, how much time do people spend making historical games and doing all the research?
So I would tell you that I'm a historian who designs war games. I'm not a war game designer who likes history. I'm actually, so I see myself as a historian, and my vehicle for getting and how I interact with history is war game design. But I'm a historian first in my mind. And what you learn as being a historian is, if you think about the sum total of human history, you know very little about it.
Right.
I mean, I know a lot about a little, but I don't know most of, human history. I don't know Asian history or African history in any level of detail. I know a lot of European history because of the wars of America. We were involved, obviously. But it's a big world, and it's a lot of years. So my own personal expertise is in what I'll call the military history of the United States.
Gotcha.
And my original degree was in ancient history, so I have a fairly strong knowledge of Greek and Roman history. But of course, there's a lot of other history. Even in the ancient world, there's tons of other history. But so if you look at what I've designed and what I've worked on, there have been moments where I've gone off of that track. But the American Revolution, American Civil War, World War II, et cetera. That's and of course, I worked in the Pentagon for over 30 years, and so I have a very strong knowledge of military operations in general. So just from a practical point of view.
So on the military side of the fence, I know it's like more, an abstract representation. Can you kind of talk about a little bit like how you prototyped that, like how you knew how to make those tracks and the clandestine tokens and everything and all that?
So again, I was talking about a piston model. I remember I spoke about that earlier.
Yeah.
So imagine you, and so another thing that was very influential in what the right side of the board is that somewhere over those years I I was in London for some reason, and I went to Churchill's war rooms, bunker. There's underneath, it's a museum.
Oh,
and
didn't know that.
if you've ever did you see the movie The Darkest Hour?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So that is the warren of rooms that Churchill operated the war from. And on every wall there are maps and they had literally, you saw them, had this group of young, mostly women, but the women and men whose job it was to keep putting the pins in the right place on the map. The pieces have to be on the right place. And so the right side of the board is meant to evoke that broad view of the war. Churchill, although he had, when he was a young man, heard bullets fired in anger, he's sitting in a bunker that's, 40 meters underground, 40 feet underground. And, and the rooms, my room here is probably the size of his cabinet room, in the bunker. It's not a lot of room. I mean, these men are sitting in a very small, you could probably reach across and, touch the other person's shoulder from where you're sitting around this table. So it's not a big table.
Okay.
And room walls are all these maps. And everywhere Churchill went during the war, those maps went with him. They called it the mobile map. And then when he went to the White House and FDR saw what he had to make him one. No,
okay,
seriously.
gotcha.
So two out of, and I don't know this for a total fact, but there's a lot of pictures of Stalin over war maps, being explained. So the way that these leaders interacted with the war was through a war game map, right?
Wow.
I mean, that's what they're looking. They don't see it soldiers. They're just looking at a map, and it's got lines and arrows and pins and and statistics, but it's a map with pieces or tags on it, and so that's what the right side is supposed to do. It's supposed to show you, and the block is what they call the front line. So the front line is here, and then maybe after a big offensive, they take a red pencil and they put it on the line and say, here's where the front line is now. So the block is evoking this redrawing of where the front lines approximately are at a very high level, obviously.
Yeah.
Every soldier wouldn't. They're not looking at where the soldiers are. And what you're doing is, they're not fighting the battles. They're agreeing that we're going to launch a big attack. See, that's what Churchill's not getting on a horse and leading the charge, against the Nazis. He and Stalin and Roosevelt are agreeing that we're going to do D-Day, or we're going to launch a big, and Stalin saying, I want to launch Bagration, which was the equivalent of D-Day on the other side. They came east and west at each other. And once they agreed to the offensive, then that was it. They then said to their general staffs, get it done, right? They don't, we're attacking, and here's what you're supposed to do. And that was how resources, you're the ones going to get the shipping and the ammunition and, the reinforcements or whatever it is how that was decided. So that's your impact. You're sort of, and it also solved the game mechanic problem, which I'll come into later, is that's what a directed offensive is. You see, it's not like, this is not optional.
Right.
You don't get to say, well, I'm not going to do that because it's not my best. No, this is what was decided in the conference, and you are going to execute that no matter whether you like it or not. And so it forces, and it's an incredibly important mechanic in the game, is because, gamers, and you're one of them, you're always looking for the edge, right? You're looking for how do I, if you're playing a game competitively, how do I get the edge? And at times, if you lost the argument, you can't now use after the fact to fix the problem. You already lost that argument. Now you got to do it, and I don't want to do it. It doesn't matter whether you want to do it. It's happening.
Right.
This is what's happening, and you got to use your resources to put it in that spot, whether you want to or not. And since nobody has control over the dice, it's going to come out the way it comes out. Although one thing in general about my game designs, I have a thing that says that if you throw enough, stuff at the problem, you're not going to lose. You may not win with grace, but you're not going to lose. So you can, and even in Churchill, you can guarantee in advance whether you get a breakthrough or not, but you can always guarantee in advance if you pilot. I always hear people go, I had everything going and then the dice killed me. I hate this game. And I go, the only reason you let the dice be in the game is your problem. That's not my problem. You gambled and lost. That's a different problem than what you're saying.
Very cool, very cool. You revisited the game, created this whole new prototype of this new version. What was your playtesting process like, and how much playtesting was kind of done at that point?
Well, remember, with a new design, there was now effectively the playtesting is zero. But I had a couple of things going for me. I had a group in New York that I find, everybody goes, did you do enough blind testing? Blind play testing. Is that how they call it?
Yep, blind play testing. Yep.
And I will tell you, based on, a lot of years doing this, blind testing is useful, but not that useful because, if the game is of any length, unless you've got a really good group. So luckily for me, there's this group called the First Minnesota, who's in Minnesota, of course. And there was a couple of guys there who the group there really liked the game, and so they did a lot of play testing of the game. That was the one I had other blind test groups, but the only one that produced, what I call very useful feedback was coming out of the First Minnesota. Then I played it a lot myself, and I have, and I'll admit that I have a terrible ability to manipulate people. If I use these really sad eyes thing I can do. And so I go to my wife, my beautiful wife, who is not really, she plays certain kind of easy games, if everybody else, it's not her thing, it's not her jam.
Yeah.
But if I look at her, I go, look, I need a play tester. And she goes to me, all right. And she actually liked Churchill because it wasn't a war game to her.
Yeah.
So she kind of liked it. In fact, as I said, there's a video of her explaining the game. And she was the theater maker, so she has got, and she's pretty, so she has a good presence on camera, better than I have, and so she did the video. So I would encourage everybody to go look at my lovely wife playing Churchill and teaching you how to play Churchill. And we went to she used to come to WBC to see my cousin who was always there, and she would walk places and people go, "Do I know you?" And because they all saw the video, it's hysterical. She was like a mini celebrity because she did this video that everybody saw. But it was kind of funny. It didn't hurt that she was attractive. That's what they were probably doing. But anyway, I digress. And so I did. So she was play testing it with me, and I had other friends that I got to play. And often when I play test, I don't play. I watch.
Okay.
And I know this is, I'm guessing from the questions, you're focusing on how do you make games as sort of like an underlying theme here.
Sure.
So sometimes you have a mechanic, and you find that nobody's doing it. They're ignoring it. Now, that's not to say that it's a good mechanic, not to say it's a bad mechanic, but whatever it is, what gamers are extraordinarily good at is they can min-max, return on investment kind of problems in their head, right?
Sure. So
I'll be in the middle of a playtest and I'll tell you what, anybody who wins this issue gets 5 victory points. And all of a sudden there's a lot of action. Now, I'm not saying it's going to stay that way, but I want to see what happens when it gets in the game. And so a lot of adjustments can sometimes occur where I'll just, I'll be playing, what's that old TV show, like Let's Make a Deal? Okay, if you show me this, I'll give you $1,000 if you got, bubble gum in your pocket, And so I'll get to see the mechanic. And then once I see it, I may like it or I don't like it. But often I find that the mechanic's good, but I didn't price it right. And once I price it better, then it starts to play in, then it starts to have the impact that I might have imagined it would have. But at first I got to see it happen. So like I said, part of my process is watching other people play the game and then intervening if I need to see something that's not happening.
unique. I've never heard of anybody kind of doing something like that.
I'm sure if you ask a bunch of game designers, they'll say, "Oh yeah, I kind of do that." It's just they may not articulate it that way.
Yeah. I know a lot of people definitely like to watch their play testers, but that's really cool that you're kind of responding and reacting to what they're doing, and to kind of develop the game while they're play testing by throwing, hey, I'll give you a couple of points. That's interesting. When you were play testing, were you doing it mostly initially with 3 players, or I guess at what point did you introduce the bots for lower player counts?
The bots were, no, the bots were definitely later in the game. No, I was play testing with 3 people.
Cool.
And if I only had 2, and I think, in fact, Jeff and I did this in Versailles. If you have 3 sometimes, what's an easy way to play a 3-player game with 2 people is you alternate playing the third party.
Oh, okay. That's
just
cool.
because you need to see the third side. And so you play it in sequence, but you'd flip off or come up with some simple technique. But no, it was I was easily, once I had my wife, I have other friends, so I could get one person and throw my wife into the mix. Then we had 3.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, and I think I feel like still 3-player games or games that are made for 3 are pretty rare.
Well, the problem with and it is and something we could talk about at any point, about alliances and ganging up and king making and all that stuff. But the trick in a 3-player game is to have a set of incentives that shift during the game so that the 2v1 becomes 1v2 at some other later point. And I can always tell when a group is playing Churchill like it's any other game they've ever played, because it always comes out that Churchill wins, which is how I set it up. It's almost like my tell that you didn't play. You guys being a collective group of people, forget about anything else. But a group of people playing the game, if Churchill wins the game consistently, then you're not playing well.
Right. Yeah. So you're play testing mostly at 3. And the bots came in later down the line.
That went on for about a year, 9 months, a year, something like that.
Okay.
But just to be clear, at the end of the day, there is no playtesting will reveal the basic issues. I mean, just letting you know. I mean, I'm if you think about, I do a lot of side analysis on the deck of cards. There's a lot of simple mathematical things and combinatorial mathematics around decks and deck construction and all that kind of stuff. So you have to be aware that, I know you told me you just got a copy of Empire of the Sun, right?
Yes.
So each side has an 84 card deck, and there's 4.529 billion hands possible out of each deck.
Wow. And
the combination of those 2 together puts you into trillions. So although you're very young, you're never going to live long enough to see all the hands that you can see in Empire of the Sun. So ultimately, I have to run a simple computer it's called a Monte Carlo simulation, because it's named after gambling, right?
Okay.
You roll the dice, and so I will literally deal out in the computer, 1 million hands of cards and take the statistics from those hands. So we're not doing it. We're actually we're not trying to. It's not a closed form a formula. So you're just dealing out a hand, 1 million of them, and then you collect how many hands would based on some criteria, would be very weak hands. How many hands would be extraordinarily strong hands? How many would be about where you want them? And even when I did Fort Sumter, I ran when I ran 100,000 hands of either side, it would say that 9 of the hands would be almost unplayable. But 9 out of 100,000, it's okay, that's right. Pretty good. Yeah, I don't care. So I did the same thing with Churchill. With the decks are set up, and the decks are, everybody loves asymmetric. Everything about Churchill is asymmetric. There is nothing symmetrical about anything in Churchill.
Right.
And most importantly, the decks of cards. They are not. They have the same number of values, the the strength of the cards is consistent across the decks, and they have one guy, the chief of staff is a die roll, so that's always at least a 1. It could be as much as a 6, but that's consistent. But the special powers change everything, and you have to play those decks differently. So for the Soviets, the way that I kept them from taking their production and using it in political things that they wouldn't have used is they get about a third of their offensive capability out of the card itself, which is not negotiable. So they can do political things, but they don't have a lot of, I call it like mandatory spending and what do you call it? Discretionary spending, right?
Yes. Yeah.
The Americans, everything about the Americans is discretionary spending. Everything about only part of the Soviets is discretionary spending, and the British are somewhere a little bit towards discretionary. And the conferences force upon the British in general costs that they don't want to spend. Like Churchill didn't want to spend money in Burma. So a lot of the cards say, oh, the British have to spend what are their resources in Burma? Oh, darn,
Right, right.
So you're pulling, so that combination of what happens in the conference cards and how many resources you have. So a lot of the British, even though the British have discretionary spending, the conference cards create a lot more mandatory spending for them that they don't like.
Gotcha.
And so that's how you get the history in it. But it's between that mandatory and discretionary spending that I handle, what your options are. And of course, the Americans have like the most powerful deck, but they got they got to fight the Pacific and Europe. The British can more or less focus on Europe, but I forced them to spend some stuff in the Pacific, and the Soviets are very focused on getting the Germans, but you can force them to do other things, but you've got to force them to do that.
Cool. At what point did you start writing the rules for Churchill?
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. So my design process is, it actually starts with the rules. I don't even play the game until I have a set of rules, because I don't know what I'm playing.
Right.
So the first thing I do is, once I get I'm not talking about like the very first day, but once I get a map and I'm kind of looking at it and what I want to do, then I immediately write a set of rules. And then that's my process. So the rules were written multiple times, but some of my games go through, 50 versions of the rules, because they start very early on, and I've just, along.
What was the biggest challenge that you think you faced when you were designing and developing Churchill?
So, and it's the thing, I'll talk about this because, so I'm not saying all, but I can't think of many examples where it's not true, that it's, the person who gets the most wins. Forget about what the most is. It could be most victory objectives. It could be most, pebbles. It could be gold coins. Whatever the heck it is, the most wins. And the tricky thing here was it was an alliance. So, but at times it was an alliance, at times it wasn't an alliance. And so the thought, and again, my master's degree is actually in national security policy, and it's a political, it's out of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And so I had a very strong view of this idea that how do you show blocks of power at a broad level. So the game has three basic states that the game is going to go through based on what the players do. There's no rules about this. This is just how you play. So condition 1 is if you win the game and the score was close, it means that you basically were not always taking the best advantage to yourself. You kept everybody else in the game, but you were clever enough to be just a little bit better. And you also made the Axis power surrender. That's important. The Axis have to surrender, and you were able to play the game of keeping the score close, and then therefore the high score wins. But that's the one block end of the war game, which is arguably how the war ended, but maybe not.
Okay.
Then the condition 2 says the Axis power is lost, but if the score got too wide, that means that the alliance somehow split. There's no rules for this, but the alliance broke apart earlier than it did historically. And that means that one country has more points than any of the other two, with a big gap. But the question is their points more than the other two combined? And that's the one that just drives everyone. And you hear people say, the person in second place wins, the game's stupid, right? And I would argue that if that's your view, then you should play another game. Right. But what it's saying is that if the Soviets got got too far out on their own agenda, the combined power of the U.S. and the British would be more than them, and whoever's the bigger dog in that coalition's the winner, because they're the bigger power. You see, it's not it's 1 + 1 = 2 versus your 1 + a half. So my 2 beats your 1. Now in the game, however, if you can make the lead big enough where the single it's got a score that's bigger than the other two combined, you still win. So it's high score wins of the block that's of the block. You see?
Right.
And then the third condition says, you know what, you three have totally messed up history. You've gone down some, who the heck knows what you did. And the Axis didn't surrender. And then it's like this, okay, who had the most points? Because now it's 3 separate countries, so each block is separate. However, if the score was close, the chaos you created, you might not win if it's close. But and everybody would go, and I would hear these things from groups. They would say, we're very competitive. We've been playing games since the beginning of time. We're the best gamers ever. And we've played Churchill 5 times, and every time the person in first place blew a die roll and they lost the game, and that's just unsatisfactory. And I'm saying, so what you're telling me is you followed a screw the other guy kind of strategy, but you didn't do a good enough job to guarantee the win, and that's my fault. So your strategy didn't work. You see, what they don't want to say is you're a genius, but your strategy didn't work part you can't accept. See, because in the game, because the die roll can only change the score by like 6 points or so. So if I have so if my lead, so if I could lose 6 and this other guy gains 6, right? If you have a 13-point lead, the dice never affect the outcome. But that means that you couldn't beat up everybody good enough to guarantee the win, and that's my fault. So you see, so when you said what was the hardest thing to do, it was communicating a non-rule set of conditions that creates an enormous amount of asymmetric and true history, but there's no rules to it other than how you score it.
Right.
And maybe I didn't do a good job, enough job explaining it, but I think the people who like Churchill get it now. The people who don't like Churchill have moved on, and that's all good. But here's the third printing.
Yeah.
and for me, I measure my success over not, units sold is always big, but how many if people keep wanting it to be around, Empire of the Sun's in its 4th printing technically, for the people who will be in its 5th printing. So those games have legs because, you don't get multiple printings of people, and that's all I want. I want people to play the game. So I'm happy about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it turned out great, and I think it's a very, I love games that have interesting victory conditions like that. They make you think as you're playing the game, so I'm on the pro side of that.
Yeah, but it's a layer of strategy that's not in almost any other game because it's just more is better.
Right. And
this is more is better depending on how you view the end of the war.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I'm not saying that I'm a master of Churchill, but I appreciate that design aspect of it. I think that's really cool. Aside from that, challenge of kind of figuring out those asymmetric victory conditions and shifting victory conditions, did you have any aha moments when you were designing it?
Each side has a superpower, right? Something. Every country has something that they're good at, that they were good at during the war. And for the Soviets, it was, they had penetrated the Manhattan Project. That was something they had accomplished that we didn't know about until, after the fact. In fact, I just saw a movie on that topic where, in the 1980s, there was this, the woman was now well into her 80s. The British arrested her for having been a Soviet spy, that they finally figured it out.
Wow.
It was her in the present and her in the past. So you saw how it all evolved and everything. And at the end, the British government just didn't prosecute her because I think they figured, it's the 1980s, the war is long over. But she was one of the people who was giving these secrets to the Soviets, and she was one of their top spies because she was giving them the plans for the bomb.
Oh,
and
wow.
then, of course, there was Fuchs, who was one of the scientists in the program, who was a Soviet spy. And then there's the Rosenbergs were spies, and there was a few others. So the superpower for the Soviets is this ability to hang into the military game on the atomic bomb. That they get points for that.
Yeah.
Then for the Americans, it was, we had all the stuff, right? So anytime, like, I'm sure you've seen situations, you weren't in situations where, look, it's my ball, I get to play, or I'm going home, right? So the Americans we own all the balls, and if you don't want to play by our rules, we're going to take the ball away. So they get the break the tie. There's enough ties in the game, and also strategically, you can create ties that lets the Americans choose. And then, of course, the British have the imperial staff, and then, of course, you've got yet. So going back to your point about complications, is the game is designed that if the British want to go first, they can almost always guarantee going first. However, they have to burn one of their 5 cards to guarantee it. And then there's always the weird moment when somebody rolls a 6. I almost always throw my chief of staff card if I have him at the the initial agenda bid, and sometimes I roll a 6 and it screws the British up. But then people go, well, then excuse me, and the British, and the British, and I'm sorry, they win the agenda, they get to go last. That's the most important. I'm sorry, I get that backwards. They're going last. And by the way, how you're sitting around the table is actually set to how they used to sit around the table. That wasn't random either. I seen people look at a picture of any of the conferences. They're always sitting around a round table, and you could see how they're sitting. And so they're sitting. And so what happens is, the trick in the game was, the British could always screw up like D-Day or some event. They got an advantage going last. And what I always point out to people is, if you gave the British the last move and only one good choice to make, you have played badly. You got to put the British on the horns of a dilemma, so they've got 3 things they want to do, and they only get to go last once. And so the way you drive things is, you can always talk to the person, you do that and I'll get you, kind of thing. But besides, I'm not a big, some people love negotiation games. They love to talk. I've played, Here I Stand. I mean, 2/3 of the time people are in other rooms talking up strategies. It just takes forever. So I just like that. Just because it takes too much time to play. So it's fun as hell. Don't get me wrong, but it takes too much time. But in Churchill, you can use the circumstances to create problems for somebody by giving them too many things they need to do. And typically, that's an edge for the British. And the Soviets always going first when the British go last is part of the game also, because that means they can always steal the atomic bomb secret.
Yeah.
So everybody's got and then the Americans are sort of sitting there, So again, America's got the strongest power, but they don't have a particularly they're not getting to go first or last a lot, which is putting them in the middle of a lot of things, which is all by intent.
I know your initial prototypes, you're drawing things or using boxes in PowerPoint and everything, but how were the art and graphic design decisions made, in the final version?
Well, first of all, Mark Simonich, who's the art director for GMT Games, and I have been friends longer than you've been alive. So let's put it that way. So I tell Mark what I was looking for, and then I told him that one of the left side to look like you're sitting at a conference table, and I told him the right side is supposed to be like broad maps of fronts and all that, and you see what he produces. And I had some comments. One of the funniest things I do with Mark, sometimes he'll give me something and he'll go, I don't really like the color on this prototype. And I always go, if I was the art director, I would change that. And he walks into it all the time. I think he does it now just to have me tell him that. I don't even think he. But anyway, so Mark, once I'm not a micromanager. In other words, as long as it looks good, I don't need to, oh, that font, I don't like that font. I mean, my biggest problems when I look at a thing is, can I read it? So sometimes I'll react to something that says, look, I can't read it, or it's that color or the type is running on top of that and I can't read it. That I will react to, but that's more. But anybody would do that. But beyond that, no, I don't make many art decisions. I did a prototype, and now you need to render it and some instruction.
Was it your idea to put some of the text on the side, the steps for the different phases? Because one thing I noticed, like when I first took out that game board, I'm like, whoa, like there are a lot of words on there. But then once we played it, I'm like, oh, this is very helpful.
What do you spend most of your time doing when you're playing a game? Hopefully, you're looking at the map,
right,
or the board.
Right.
Not always map. So you're looking at the board. So if there's a bunch of like procedural stuff, I can do one of two things. I give you a play aid card sometimes, and that's a very preferred solution. But I like it if it's just like right in front of me.
Yeah.
And as long as it's not such that, and I think Eurogamers hate that as a general rule, because I've heard that comment from people. I watch a lot of other people's reviews of other games. It goes, I hate that there's all this type on the map. It's too busy, and I don't like this. So that's just a taste great less filling problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's no right answer to it. It's just what do you like, and what you like is what you like. So no, I as long as it's readable, but I like putting as much information that's not getting in the way of the map or the board or whatever the functionality is. By putting it right there, you don't have to go, what are the Emperor's surrender rules? What are the rules for the atomic bomb? And it's like, if I can stick it right there, why would I stick it somewhere else? It's like the board becomes its own play aid card then. Again, That's a philosophy thing. That's not a right or wrong answer. It's just how I like it.
Cool.
And when you design a game, you typically get your way.
Good point. So you already touched upon how you came up with the name Churchill for the game, or why you decided to call the game Churchill. But when did you know the game was finished and ready to be produced? Like, did you just keep it on P500 and redesign the whole thing, or did you launch a new P500 pre-order?
No, we didn't. I think I might have posted a few things. I made some changes. The description of the game ultimately didn't change, but everything else changed.
Right.
And since nobody knew, other than the playtest, nobody knew what those changes were. It didn't affect anything. And obviously, it was interesting that it's not a crossover game like Twilight Struggle was, but it definitely caught the interest of a bunch of people who were not war gamers. And so I got a bunch of reviewers who were not war game reviewers seeing it. And you got anything from, wow, I really like this, to this is the word. I think one guy gave it the, what do you call it? Like a blacklist, or, he blackmailed. I don't know what the word was, but, he gave it it was worse than a double thumbs down. And he's not a bad guy, because I remember there was some exchange we had, and after one game of the year, I said, yeah, well, sometimes, you have a view, and sometimes it still wins game of the year. He goes, yeah, point taken, so
yeah.
A lot of people are very in love with their own opinion, and they can't understand why nobody else agrees with them. And I don't know, there's, if you go on Empire of the Sun, or even Churchill, there's this one guy, just look for the longest rating reply, and you'll find some people. One guy wrote something like, I think it was 5,000 words of why he hates the game. I mean, but he keep coming back to it to write more why he hates the game, and I'm okay with that. It's you don't become a game designer and put stuff out in the public and you have oh my God, you said something mean about me. I don't care.
Right.
I really don't care. I design games that I want to play, and if nobody else plays them, well, that's their loss. But I'm still happy. I play my own games, so. But so again, it's that it caught that kind of audience vibe, and I think, like I said, I see people playing them in conventions all the time. So that tells me that somebody likes it.
Right. After your playtesting, did it go through any kind of development with within the GMT team, or it was just you felt like it was dialed in and was cool, print it?
That's not my. I don't use a developer. I mean, just so you understand, I came into the business in September of 1976, and there was at SPI, the Simulations Publications Incorporated, where I started, there was a very defined designer-developer process. So I was a developer before I was a designer. And quite frankly, the biggest hassle I've ever seen is when the developer decides to do a different game than the one he got from the designer. And at this point, in the way that the industry has evolved, design is really the easy part, development. So I'm really developing my own ideas. And what I have used, though, effectively is, because, I think I write well, but, when you develop a set of rules over time, you lose perspective on, you might have layered on a little bit. And so so I've used Kai Jensen and a few other people as a rules editor. So I do use a rules editor, and their job is to take what I've given them, which is the game, and then see if they can write it a little bit more friendly, or maybe I layered it too hard and they and I find that ultimately I get back, 80% of what I wrote, but with some improvements, and that's kind of what goes out. But I don't use a developer.
Cool. Do you have any advice for someone who's interested in designing a political strategy game?
Well, one, you should be really jazzed about the topic. In other words, just sort of wake up, I'm just going to do a political game. I don't even like political games, or I don't even like that pittle, but I'm going to do it about this part of history that I don't like. That would be kind of like, why? But assuming that you've got I believe it all starts with passion for the topic. So I think if you have passion for the topic, whatever it is, you're going to want to immerse yourself in the topic. And in that immersion, that will, I think, sort of give you whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, it'll give you a perspective about the topic. And the other thing is, ultimately, if you've never done it before, and if your only intention is to get a game published with your name on it as a, bucket list thing or whatever, I'm sure that's accomplished. That can be accomplished. You can always self-publish these days, and say you did it. But I think you should want to do a game that you just really want to play, that your friends want to play. And then if that's what all you ever accomplished, that would be accomplishing whatever. Now, if you can now get through a process with a publisher, that's like another whole almost a separate set of skills and issues. And like I said, many people come out of nowhere and do great things. So it's very doable. But I think it always has to begin with the passion for the topic is my biggest thing, and be less concerned about making money. I mean, if you're gonna be a game designer and your whole goal is to make money, then you should probably do the stock market or something. But you'll do better. The number of games that have big sales, like Essen years ago, I don't know what it is now, but there's pretty much 3 to 5 games published per day in a year. Yeah, I mean, Essen had years ago 630 something new game titles showing up, and that was just from Essen. Forget about what else happened during the rest of the year.
Yeah. So
there's multiple games. I mean, I'm talking about Euro. I'm talking about everything, right? And the industry's about, I guess, the industry's about probably close to $3 billion. The board game business, and forget about the video games. That's more like $75 billion, $80 billion these days. But it's like a $3 billion business. So the number of successes that you can name you could count them on one hand with fingers left over in any given year. So your game is likely to go nowhere. I don't mean that as a bad thing. It's just you're not going to make 1 million sales. So yeah, you'll sell 500 of them or 1,000 of them. That's great. That's a huge success. You see what I'm trying to say? So if your end goal is to be the one game, all right, that means anybody should have any goal they want, but that's not realistic.
Yeah.
It's just not realistic. And so realistic goals, passion and realistic goals, I think will get you to a good outcome, psychically, product-wise, whatever. And if you happen to do the next great thing, well, then that was your lucky moment, and you deserve it. That should not be your goal, even though I think everybody goes into it that way.
Gotcha. Yep. I feel you. Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining me today on Cardboard Creations. It has been great talking to you, and I love kind of hearing the backstory of Churchill. I know all the games in the Great Statesman series are really cool. You had Pericles, which I still haven't played yet, but I'm so intrigued by. It's on my shelf. I started learning at some point, but Pericles, then I played Versailles 1919 several times, really dig it. I'm looking forward to Triumvir, which I hope will be coming out soon. But is there anything else, either in the Great Statesman series or just anything else you're working on that you'd like to mention?
Well, I mean, I spent most of COVID finishing Pacific War, and that's gone now. That's out now. And
yeah.
So Rebel Fury, which is a Civil War battle game series, is closest to next. And then Triumvir is in play testing. And then I've probably got another. There'll be one more title or two in this year that'll get far advanced, and then I've got like a dozen more I want to do. So yeah, I'll be doing this for a while.
Cool. Love it. Yep, I'm looking forward to playing more of your games.
I want to give a shout out to my new grandson Ari Herman, who's now 9 days old.
Aww,
so Ari, if you ever see this, Grandpa loves you.
Congratulations.
All right, thanks.
Cool. Thanks again, Mark. Thank you all for watching Cardboard Creations. Hopefully it's been as inspiring and fascinating for you as it has been for me. And remember, the only way to get something done is to start doing it.